For one, something essential is missing from the debate about the risks of inflation today, and this is especially mind-boggling because what is missing is the central insight of economics since Adam Smith. And if you don't know who Adam Smith is, he was an economist that lived back in the 1700s. The role of competition, though, basically the last time inflation was a problem in the United States was back in the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s when large sectors of the economy um, were dominated by oligopolies and monopolies, and competition was much weaker back then. Today, the near monopolies of that period are gone, and the ability to raise prices in most sectors can last only temporarily, can only last until temporary bottlenecks are cleared. Um, to be specific about this, in the 1960s and 70s, American steel companies raised their prices in concert almost every year. When the former presidents John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson spoke out against what they believed were inflationary increases, U.S. Steel and the powerful American Iron and Steel Institute told the two presidents to mind their own fucking business, and the price increases usually stuck. It was the same in the auto industry that dominated the post-World War II manufacturing sector. Taking a look back into the 1960s and early 1970s, the Big Three, which would mean GM, Ford, and Chrysler, had roughly 90% of the U.S. car market. The haughty CEOs and Republican congressional allies ridiculed legislators who had the temerity to criticize their pricing and design decisions. The Big Three competed over fins and taillights and the supersized land boats that they turned out, but competition on price, quality, economy, and durability were all out of bounds. The Big Three CEOs said that building small cars in the U.S. could not be profitable, and they joined forces to strangle American Motors, whose CEO George Romney did want to make small cars here. They also attacked Walter Reuther, the progressive auto union leader, who wanted the U.S. companies to make small cars, foreseeing that his members would lose jobs to imports otherwise. The CEOs told Reuther in no uncertain terms that these decisions were theirs alone to make, and that his suggestions crossed a line. It is enough to say that in 2021 that there are perhaps 20 companies making cars all over the U.S., and that the inflexible, short-sighted oligopoly of the big three is no more. In the 1970s, the original AT&T company, nicknamed Ma Bell, had 85% of the telephone market. Its army of lawyers dominated the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and state regulatory bodies, but the monopoly worked to prevent new competitors from offering competing service and felt itself so powerful that it could squeeze even larger customers. Its stranglehold was broken. However, when to its surprise, companies like Westinghouse turned on at the FCC and backed an upstart newcomer, MCI. MCI was a tiny Illinois company that had been selling CB radios to truckers, but that decided to fight AT&T to get a license to operate across state lines. In a decade-long legal battle that the little David broke the Goliath's monopoly with help from the FCC staff, and it opened up gates to the many competitors that occupy Ma Bell's old space today. The Civil Aviation Board, from 1938 to the 1960s, allowed no new interstate airlines to enter the U.S. market. The board set fares and limited routes, and the old airlines dominated the CAB hearings, and it basically prevented newcomers from entering. In this closed system, the airline machinist leader in the 1960s, Roy C. Miller, was, I don't know if I'm saying that right, C. Miller last name, was asked by President Johnson to limit the wage increase to 5%. C. Miller blew off Johnson and demanded a 25% jump that opened a huge hole in the wage price guidelines that the president was trying to put in place to limit inflation. The eventual comeuppance for the big airlines was the end of cozy regulation and the demise of the CAB that sheltered them from new competitors. Price fixing by railroads and trucking companies was the rule until well into the 1970s. Every president, going from Franklin Roosevelt in the late 1930s, had wanted to open up this inflation-prone system to competition, but they were afraid of the truckers, teamsters, and railroad brothers who did extremely well when competition was weak. And most interstate transportation modes were regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, a post-Civil War agency originally meant to curb the pricing power of railroads but that had been taken over by the interest it was supposed to check. President Carter's appointees at the ICC, however, did not play the game and ruled against the price fixing by railroads and trucking companies in 1980, and the Congress Congress ratified the changes. Transportation's cost dropped far and fast. In the 1970s, when inflation was a problem, the retail sector was only beginning to be changed by fierce competition from Walmart. By the 1980s, as inflation in this sector receded, one commentator said Walmart did more to fight inflation than the Federal Reserve, and he was probably fucking right. Today, however, even Walmart is facing competition from Amazon, among others. The above is to say that because of more intense competition, there are downward pressures on prices in manufacturing, communications, transportation, retail, and other sectors that did not exist in the inflationary part during the 60s and 70s. Inflation, hacks like the supremely competent former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who was a Democrat, and the supremely tiresome monetarists, mostly Republicans, never mentioned the price damping changes and the intensity of competition cited above. But these kinds of changes in the way people have in markets, however, were the central focus of Adam Smith, whose overarching economic insight was that monopolies supported by government made things like grain for bread too expensive. As everyone should know, he also wanted competitive markets to replace the state-backed monopolies in shipping and dozens of products like tea. But remember the Boston Tea Party that raised prices? He urged legislators to break up such monopolies, stressing repeatedly that monopolists and their workers would put up furious resistance to allowing any new competitors to come in. The furious resistance to domestic as well as foreign competition is what U.S. faces today, not inflation. The oligopolies and monopolies of the period from the 1960s into the 80s are gone in competition, and these large sectors and others are still fucking strong. But this means that in a short time, the bottlenecks raising prices of things like gasoline, lumber, semiconductors, meat, and some types of labor will be opened up as economies and people compete, and inflation will not be a problem. Yep.